Hello and welcome to another Nordic APIs LiveCast. So this is our series where we feature lightning talks from core community members on specific subjects. And in today's hour-long webinar, we'll be diving into API business. Specifically, we'll be looking at different monetization strategies out there throughout the space and different ways we can improve developer relations to complement that. So my name is Bill Doerrfeld. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nordic APIs blog, and I'll be hosting here today. And here with me, we have two experts, both Nordic APIs rookie speakers, I think. We have Kumar Kandaswamy, VP of Ecosystem Development at RapidAPI, as well as Daniel Giordano, Product Marketing at API at Smartbear. Hey, Kumar.
Hi there.
Hi there. First off, I just wanted to introduce Kumar to everyone. He's the VP of Ecosystem Development for RapidAPI, which is the world's largest API marketplace with thousands of APIs and over 500,000 developers. He's a serial platform builder and entrepreneur for over 12 years, encompassing eBay, Best Buy, Chegg, among others. Kumar's platform journey began in 2006 when he joined eBay and was responsible for the eBay Developers Program. eBay was the first in the market to launch public APIs in November 2000, and its third-party developer ecosystem accounts for over 20% of its business, 19 billion out of its overall 84 billion global GMV in 2016. So he was responsible for driving their e-commerce product strategy at Best Buy and API-based emerging business initiatives where the team he built from scratch delivered the first 100 million revenue in less than 20 months. At Chegg, he developed their open platform strategy and roadmap, which was a critical part of taking Chegg through the IPO process and successfully delivered the strategic partnerships with Coursera and internships.com. So Kumar coming in with a lot of background, kind of from a larger industry perspective. So we're very happy to have him here for this talk. He'll be describing the ultimate pricing API guide, which we've actually featured on the Nordic APIs blog in the past. So Kumar, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation today. Excellent,
thank you. We also have Daniel from Smartbear here with us. And hey, Daniel, thanks for joining us today. Daniel has nearly a decade of experience developing and marketing websites, software as a service applications, and APIs. He was first marketer on the cross-browser testing platform acquired by Smartbear, was consumed by the front-end world of testing, but has since then moved back to the back-end testing world. Dan runs messaging and positioning for RapidAPI, the world's leading API quality platform, and works out of their Somerville, Massachusetts HQ. Daniel's going to be talking about how to create APIs that your users love without driving your development team crazy. So I'm guessing a lot of helpful insights on testing and good developer relations and developer experience. So thanks, Daniel. Have you here.
Thanks for asking me to be on. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. So first off, if you viewer have not tuned in for a Nordic API session in the past, we're just doing 15-minute lightning talks for these live casts, followed by an open Q&A. So if you do have a YouTube account, that's all you need. You just ask a question through that, and we'll try and answer that after the speaker presentations. First off, I'd just like to give a brief introduction into what we're doing at Nordic APIs and how these online events kind of fit into our greater mission to make the world programmable. So we're hosting events all over the world. We do this yearly platform summit in Stockholm, which we just had just a few weeks ago. We also maintain a high impact blog with 2 thought leadership style pieces per week. We also publish ebooks on many different API related subjects. And this is kind of what our community is like. We have a lot of API owners, practitioners, people that are using APIs, and then different tooling specialists helping out, as well as people who don't do any of that and just write, like myself and others. So we're looking at the space. We're trying to provide some insights to help others. And I maintain the blog. Like I said, we're very open to community submissions. We would love to hear your API story. Our blog receives over 150,000 views per month. We aim for this vendor neutral style. And like I said, submissions are always welcome, and you can contact me at bill@nordicapis.com. Our next event is the Austin API Summit. This will be our second time back in Austin, and this is happening in May. We just announced the call for speakers, so check that out if you'd like to provide some more insights. And like I said, the Platform Summit happens every October in Stockholm. Our 2018 speaker videos are now live on YouTube, so there's a huge wealth of content out there now, from API business, API marketing strategy, down to development and design comparisons. We have a lot of great stuff from that presentation. So check that out there. Announcing our Best Public API 2008 competition was very fun at the Platform Summit. RingCentral got the win, but we're going to be doing this back again in 2018, so stay tuned for that. We do have a newsletter with some great API Digest insights, so you can sign up there at that URL if you're interested in following this forward. Like I said, the ebooks are out there, free to consume, free to download straight from our site. A lot of different topics being represented there. But that's not what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about generating some sort of monetization strategy for our APIs, and kind of looking at the business side of things, which is a little bit underrepresented in a lot of our technical-minded discussions around application programming interfaces and the World Wide Web. So that's kind of why I assembled this webinar, just to dig into that a little bit more. So I just wanted to give a brief overview on what I found throughout researching the space, in terms of generating some sort of return on income for an API. As we've seen, APIs have emerged as big business. That's according to VentureBeat, but according to many sources and evidenced by many different things happening throughout the space. One is just the sheer growth of the economy. So I think in 2013, Programmable Web estimated that there was around 10,000 public APIs in existence. Well, that number has jumped and doubled to 20,000 here in 2018. And we're also seeing many new entrants enter the space, whether it be banking, kind of stimulated from open banking, other brick and mortar businesses. We see some governments turning to APIs for open data initiatives, but it really doesn't stop in any sort of industry or sector. If we turn to retail, e-commerce, different artificial intelligence moves, a lot of these institutions are using APIs to propagate their data. And if we just turn to the wider interest, we see so many acquisitions of different tooling in our space. If we just look to the API management platforms to see how they've been acquired since 2015 onwards, just some evidence of a growing economy and some larger interest in APIs in general. And we've seen the platform idea emerge as a really successful model. Companies like Twilio, Shopify, DocuSign, and Spotify that are embracing a third-party innovative developer program attitude are actually doing really well in the marketplace. It's been a while since anyone really dug into the different business models out there, and I think John Musser was the last to really exemplify each different type in his 20 business models presentation. In that, he found some different high-level types in which, one, the developer was using a free API, Another strategy is that they pay, whether it be freemium, unit-based, tiered, pay-as-you-go, or some other sort of transaction. And the third strategy is that the developer actually does receive some sort of payment for use, either being a revenue share agreement or some sort of affiliate marketing agreement. But there's a lot more indirect models and partner models, especially with content syndication, other internal usages, and software as a service products. So I highly recommend checking out this presentation. I've inserted the link down there for some quality information on different business models throughout the space. But I think we're going to hit on that a little bit more throughout today's live cast as well. The way I see it is a more simpler view is that really there are three types of APIs. Something that is kept private and internal, something that is kept in a more partner kind of approach, and then something that is more public with self-service opportunities and more of an open API. And really we've seen that this is a good provisioning strategy as well, starting with something internal, moving more partner, and then moving more open eventually. Some examples of that internal approach are reducing costs internally. Netflix, for example, uses a single API to streamline their internal operations and service devices regardless of platform. We also saw Badoo, a Russian dating online service, and we saw them talk about their internal API and how that's similarly helping them with their data initiatives. So APIs can reduce costs, streamline operations internally, but they can also offer, like that partner model, exclusive access to valuable data. Some examples of that are eBay, Amazon, and Instagram is doing a lot with their partner advertising programs and APIs recently. And then the third is the public model. So the more open model that's open to more innovation. It's good for software as a service, and it's also great for even R&D in a way, if you're going to take that kind of route, giving the keys to developers to create new iterations off your platform. And yeah, we're seeing still a lot of use in this open, more public model. Something we featured on the blog, for example, was the car registration API, something that went from 3 to 3 million calls, I think he quoted in the article, in the matter of a few months. So people are making waves still with public models in the space. But thinking of that, we really need to fine-tune our approach to how we treat API as a product, right? There's many different ways to be charging for access. Some models work as more of a free model where the brand is the thing that is being traversed throughout networks and helping the product grow. Others rely on some sort of freemium model or some sort of direct charge, whether it be per call or subscription model. So that's kind of what I'm wondering here, are what are the strategies for different API pricing models? And what are some best practices for API business in general? So I think I'm just going to open the floor now, and we'll transfer things over to Kumar, and hopefully he can help answer some of these difficult questions. So without further ado, here you go, Kumar.
Hey, thanks, Bill, and hello everyone. Really excited to be here and share some of my experience. Let's see if we have the screen sharing going. Are you able to see it?
Yeah, I see it. Okay.
Perfect. All right. Yeah, really excited about today's topic. Like Bill mentioned, I've been in this space for a long time and have a lot of personal experience, and excited about being able to share some of those things with you. So today's content is really going to be focused on these 5 topics. First and foremost is something that Bill alluded to in terms of how businesses use APIs for monetization. Touch upon that, and then look at what are some of the common or traditional pricing models and what are the advantages and disadvantages of them. And then talk about a free pricing tier and why companies should consider having a free tier. The next is what are some kind of examples of how the different industry prices APIs, and what have we learned from them? And last but not least, kind of like putting that whole strategy into practice with some examples from what we have seen. Before going into the content, I thought like a brief introduction. Bill covered most of it. I think I've been kind of in this space for a long time. So the context is really about the 12 years of experience, having done this both at large companies like eBay and Best Buy, as well as earlier stage companies and startups like Chegg and RapidAPI. So that's what I'm looking forward to sharing. And then also we have a lot of insights, having built RapidAPI over the last 3 years to become the world's largest API marketplace. On one end of the marketplace, we have over 8,000 APIs, and on the other end, over 500,000 developers across the globe. So that we are able to kind of use that as a way to understand the dynamics within this larger API economy that's driving various different industries, like what Bill was talking about. With that introduction, just wanted to get into the agenda. Let's talk about like how businesses use APIs for monetization. So I just put together some examples of companies that large tech companies, and how API is a key part of their kind of growth and innovation. First example is Salesforce. I read an article recently which talked about over half of their revenue is actually driven through APIs for Salesforce as a company, and it's continuing to be a larger share of their overall business. eBay, where I used to run the eBay developers program, almost 2/3 of the items you see on eBay is actually listed via an app that uses an API. The 60% is kind of an interesting number because it combines both internal apps that are owned and managed by eBay, as well as third-party apps that use the open API. So that has a very significant effect on the overall business. Expedia, they do a lot of affiliate marketing type kind of integration, and over 90% of their revenue is actually driven through all these API integration from various travel aggregators and so on. And last, of course, Amazon, which is with their AWS, over 10% of their revenue is driven through the API business. And interestingly, almost 2/3 of their profits is actually coming from the revenue generated by AWS. So that speaks to the profound impact that the platform has for Amazon's business. Having talked about some large tech companies, the next set of example is really going to talk about companies that really provide API as their main product or service. Twilio being one of them. They went public, and today they're valued at over $8 billion, primarily offering telco-related APIs, SMS, and so on. SendGrid is another example, valued at $2 billion, where primarily API is their main product. DocuSign, the same thing about document management, almost $7 billion. And last but not least, Stripe, as one of the leading payment API provider. The recent valuation is over $20 billion. So that's some examples of what the companies have done. Now let's talk about what's kind of some of the models. One is the notion that the API itself is free. So from a developer usage standpoint, it comes as free. So then putting the lens of what's the benefit or what's the ultimate monetization kind of strategy behind it, starting with Facebook. Their whole login with Facebook is all about using the API to collect data. And if you think about what is Facebook trying to do, is to have a better understanding of the social graph that they are building. And once they have that, they ultimately can have a better view of the consumer and ultimately monetize that based on the data and insights that they gather. So that's just one example around the API itself is free, but the intent is to collect data that ultimately helps them monetize over the long haul. The next example is eBay. I talked about this briefly as part of the introduction, where here eBay's main focus is about digital distribution. So in a nutshell, what eBay is trying to do when they launched in November of 2000 is really to figure out how could we have an external ecosystem extend the reach of eBay beyond what eBay can do on its own. So that was the fundamental premise of opening up the API almost 18 years ago. And with that, if you look at the numbers, it actually proves that a large ecosystem that actually is able to create this impact to the tune of almost 20% of its transaction volume. And in 2010, when I left eBay, the number was about $7 billion. And last year's number is almost 3 times, which is $19 billion. So that's continuing to grow. And the idea is to kind of use API and the ecosystem to extend your reach in the form of a digital distribution. And Best Buy is another example. I don't have the numbers on the slide, but when I joined Best Buy in 2010, the idea was, how do we kind of create a partner and developer ecosystem to have a much larger digital footprint beyond BestBuy.com and the mobile apps that Best Buy had. And we were able to deliver over $250 million in less than 3 years. And that's kind of really the kind of opportunity. And here, for the developer or the partner to use the API, it's free because ultimately the company that's providing the API is gaining more business by expanding their digital footprint. The third kind of example in this free API usage model is Slack, where if you think about Slack as a messaging platform, they provide some core kind of functionality around messaging, but they really encourage developers to build custom integration that makes it much more compelling beyond the core product that Slack offers. So this almost kind of allows for product stickiness. So even if somebody wants to kind of consider a different platform other than Slack, it becomes much harder because now you're really connected to not just the core messaging kind of capability, but also other things. So there is motivation for Slack to open it up for free so that there is a larger innovation that's happening on the platform. And the second category, of course, is really about the developer or the user of the API having to pay for the service. Some examples we touched upon earlier on: Twilio, SendGrid, Stripe, and so on. And really, the idea is either there is a certain capability, like in the case of Twilio, it's SMS, and with Stripe, it's payment, or it's some kind of a data that external entities are willing to pay for it. So that's kind of the broad kind of like landscape of the different kind of usage model and what's the motivation behind these companies doing the API models. Now let's talk about some of the common pricing models that are out there, and then what are the pros and cons. So the first and foremost is pay-as-you-go. That's like a traditional kind of model where you're paying per individual call, and you just as you grow, you just continue to kind of like pay for the additional kind of call volume. The other one is really fixed kind of quota, where the developer or the user purchases kind of a fixed number of calls per month, and then kind of use that for their kind of needs. What we found on Rapid, kind of analyzing these thousands of APIs that we have, specifically looking at the pay-as-you-go APIs, that the average price per call is about 3 cents. Of course, it varies by the functionality and what is the main kind of purpose of the API. But this is one of the interesting kind of like insight that we gathered looking at the thousands of API that we have on the marketplace. Talking about the pros and cons, on the pay-as-you-go, the obvious benefit is really as you have added growth, the pricing kind of scales with that. And it actually works for use cases or apps where you don't have a sense of how much, and so you actually are able to kind of pay as your application needs grow. So that's like the advantage of the pay-as-you-go model. Whereas the downside of that particular model is that the revenue for the provider is not predictable. And then the pricing, of course, varies monthly for the developer or the user of the API. And so it's very hard to budget for the consumption of the API. So that's kind of the issue with the pay-as-you-go model. Whereas for the fixed quota, it's predictable pricing because it's kind of like fixed for a certain quota of the API calls. And for the provider, it's a fixed predictable revenue based on the customer base that they have. And the other benefit for the API provider is that they actually get more revenue from low volume developers because they are not using the total quota that's been assigned for their usage. The major downside of this particular model is that the app that's using this fixed quota model shuts down after the quota is reached, which is absolutely not a good scenario for the app developer. With that, the whole introduction of the overage model or a tiered kind of pricing model, and the notion is you buy a quota of calls at a particular tier, and then you pay for additional call volume. So it's really kind of combining the benefits of the pay-as-you-go and the fixed quota model, and have a experience that works for various types of applications. And so the benefit of the overage model is that it's predictable pricing. Because you have that the quota for a particular tier, and then for the provider, it's the revenue is also predictable. Whereas the huge benefit that was the issue with the fixed quota model is that the app in this case will actually never shut down because you're going to actually continue to have the ability to have extra API calls even you go beyond the quota. The thing to consider, and having done this for a number of years, one of the key kind of challenge around this particular model for the provider is to make sure there's clear communication about what is the pricing structure, and there is no ambiguity or misunderstanding around that. And so that's the main thing to focus on when you actually have a tiered or an overage model as the way you price your API. Next, the topic is around free pricing tier. The question is, why should the provider consider having a free tier? And just to kind of be on the same page with the different types of API, free where there are really no kind of paid option. The examples are eBay and Best Buy, where it's basically free APIs. Freemium, where there is a limited free tier with a kind of a small quota. And then beyond that, there are one or more paid options that you actually can kind of move into based on your usage. And of course, paid is there are no free options at all. So with that, we actually did an analysis of almost 2,000 API in our marketplace. And what we found is that developers are 3 times more likely to subscribe to a plan that has a free tier. And the primary reason for that is they would prefer to try before they ultimately buy. And so that's kind of the main focus. If you look at the chart, that actually shows the actual distribution of the developers across these thousands of APIs. And the provider, the benefit for them to kind of offer a very limited kind of free tier is that it's almost more of a creating some kind of a stickiness and making it hard to switch, because once a developer embeds the API, there is some cost. I mean, of course, depending on the application, it might be high or low, but there is an implicit cost in switching to a different API. So this is something we have kind of discovered from analyzing hundreds of APIs, is that you should truly consider having more of a freemium approach as opposed to just paid options, because that creates more of the stickiness and developers kind of using your API. And so now let's get to the crux of what we are talking about. How does the industry price the different APIs, and ultimately talk about the pricing strategy, putting that to practice. So deciding on the pricing structure really has the three main considerations. First and foremost is the overall model, like I talked about, overage model or pay as you go or the fixed quota. What is the model that you're going to go with? And then what's the frequency in terms of the whole billing cycle? Is it like per day, per month, per year kind of subscription or the payment cycle? And then the last one is the pricing per object. A good example of that is Twilio, where it could be literally one API call, but that could be 1,000 SMS messages being sent out. So in this case, the object is the SMS, the number of recipients of the message. Right? Per request is pretty straightforward. Every call is considered as like one request, and then we are charged based on that. There is also companies that actually do a hybrid model where we do the combination of both the object that they actually are providing the service for and the request to make sure they're able to kind of like monitor the usage and consumption of the combination. And so this is an example of what we have on RapidAPI, where you see the fact that each kind of pricing plan has the combination of the request, which is the APIs themselves, and then the results from those APIs, so that there is a good way to have a control based on this hybrid plan that the provider has. And from analyzing a lot of the APIs that we have, this is generally kind of the broad buckets or broad tiers of pricing. By no means this is set in stone. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, it all depends on what's the service that you're delivering and what's the value that's associated with the service. And we'll get into that in the next section around like how do you figure out the value. But this is what we have seen as kind of broad kind of tiers across various categories and various different kind of types of APIs. And then kind of looking at the pricing kind of strategy in practice, the thing that we look at is 3 C's of pricing API. So the first one is around what's the capability. So what is the core functionality that you are providing with the API, and how valuable is each call to deliver that particular functionality. The second one is what's the cost for you to be able to kind of fulfill a call, just so that you have an understanding of the operating cost for the API. And last C is what's the competition? How are other industry players charging for either that same functionality or similar capability if you're fairly new to the market? So really, your pricing should be based on the combination of these 3 factors, ultimately deciding on what makes sense for you. So the first example of this is the category of business data API. And we recently actually launched Crunchbase on RapidAPI. And if you look at the pricing tier, this is kind of way off compared to all the data points that I've shared. And the reason for that is really looking at these 3 C's. First and foremost, the capability. They actually provide a lot of business intelligence for somebody who's actually trying to analyze a company or a particular kind of industry. And the different kind of like use cases or apps, applications include shallow searches, as well as kind of going a deeper dive. So that's kind of a key consideration for how you want to price the API. And then the cost Most of the cost is actually minimal, but they also, Crunchbase provides this in collaboration with other vendors. So if you look at this as a category, you'll think this as a little bit of a mixed bag, where some cost that is predictable and minimal, but there are other kind of data sources that they combine with that relies on external entities. And competition is very little, and they actually have very specialized information that certain segments are looking for, right? So if you look at the pricing, basic is free with not a lot of kind of access, whereas if you look at the pro plan, it's $10,000. So again, this speaks to the fact that it's a very kind of high on the capability spectrum with low competition, and the value associated with this quite high for somebody looking at the data set that comes with the Crunchbase API. Again, Crunchbase is just an example, but the broader category of business data API. The second one is around SMS API. Just kind of picked some example of the key players. Of course, there is a lot more players in the marketplace, and the capability is fairly similar by different endpoints or different kind of use cases, and the cost is fixed. If you look at the range, it's pretty much within a very kind of like a short range, and a very tight margin. And telco business in general is very tight with margins. There's a lot of like infrastructure investment that they have to make, and then the competition is high. So if you look at the pricing, you don't have a lot of leeway of somebody who's actually going to provide a functionality. So you just have to figure out what kind of makes sense within the spectrum for the value that your API brings to the table. And then the last one is around shipping API. Here, the capability is very similar. Ultimately, it's kind of product shipping from one point to another. And there is like fixed number of kind of players that exist in a particular geography. That speaks to the competition side of things. And then the prices are high, and there is a notion of having a fixed fee for like outside vendors. Again, the idea is to kind of provide some kind of a benefit for larger volume. So here, I think you'll have a slightly kind of higher rates for kind of the low usage scenario. And then for bulk consumers of the API, you actually can provide a lot more of a discount for that. So those are the three examples that kind of really puts this the three C's to test in terms of looking at the capability, the cost, and competition, and ultimately figuring out your pricing strategy. So the quick summary on this is really list out the specific kind of API use cases around the capability, cost, and competition, and determine which is the most kind of dominant C that drives your pricing strategy, and then make sure you kind of like look at the competitive landscape to make sure you are in range to the value that you actually bring to the table. And kind of the final thoughts on this talk is really, first and foremost, is to kind of like decide which model works, looking at the pros and cons that we went through, either the pay-as-you-go, the fixed quota, or the whole tiered kind of model with the overage. And then the big kind of recommendation from all the years of experience is make sure there is more of a freemium approach to your pricing structure so that it increases the developer kind of interest, and then ultimately ongoing kind of adoption of your API. And then make sure you kind of do deep dive on the three C's to decide on what is the pricing strategy that's optimal for you. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is get the most value for the capability that you've already created. And kind of opening up to a larger ecosystem is all about extracting the most value from the capability. And last is to make sure the tiers that you're coming up with kind of is in line with what kind of makes sense for the different use cases. So if you look at the various different types of the APIs on Rapid, we actually see these 4 categories for the most part, but the range of each of them actually vary based on what's the core capability that you're providing. So that's all I wanted to kind of like share. More than happy to take any questions that you might have from the topic that we covered, or any other topic that you feel related to monetization and pricing that you have.
Awesome. Thank you, Kumar. Thanks so much for sharing with us. I think we're really lucky to have someone with your sort of experience. I mean, you were really spearheading some of these first ecosystem initiatives at the very start of this whole API movement, whereas others like myself just came in quite recently in comparison. So it's cool that you've seen the progression, but also now you're pretty uniquely positioned at RapidAPI, where you're seeing all these different sort of APIs, and it's a nice platform to compare them all. So yeah, some interesting perspective there. Some takeaways I had were like the average price per call. I think that's important, of the 3 cents, and then the whole try before you buy attitude with developers now, and then those 3 C's. Those really, really helpful stuff. Regardless of how these sort of models apply to everyone, because everyone's going to have some sort of unique proposition, right? It really helps having some sort of baseline. Here's the average price for a freemium model, and the mid-tier and enterprise level. So it's helpful having that. I'm not seeing any questions for Q&A currently, but I had one actually. I was interested in what your take on GraphQL is and how that might be affecting how we price APIs. Because with GraphQL, you can be using a single request to return multiple data objects, multiple returns in a single request. So are you seeing any changes in terms of monetization to reflect that?
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. I think taking a step back, really it's about kind of bundling, or really kind of figuring out what is the set of API that makes it more atomic for a particular use case or a set of use cases. So I think as we have gone through the last 15, 20 years of the API economy kind of evolving, the next stage is about kind of looking at how do we kind of think beyond just one entity as the API provider, and then kind of bring a collection of APIs. In fact, one of the new enhancements that we are going to roll out at RapidAPI is really the notion of collections. And the idea is you want to kind of provide a more of a developer-centric experience. So if somebody is building an e-commerce app, so there is a certain set of APIs that are going to be required. And so how do you make sure you kind of make it much more easier to be discovered and consumed? And the other side of the equation is, how do the providers kind of ultimately think about this as a new opportunity, beyond just thinking about themselves as an individual provider, thinking about themselves as being part of a larger kind of ecosystem of providers, even within e-commerce, or within it could be banking and so on.
Right.
So for sure, that's something we are starting to see, and we are having discussions with different providers about looking at this a little bit more holistically, as opposed to just much more of a siloed view. And it's just a matter of time. Over the next 6 to 12 months, you're going to start seeing some of those new pricing models coming into the market. But that's a very good observation from your end.
Yeah, let's keep in touch about that. I'd be interested in having you guys share some more in the future when you do reach that point in 6 to 12 months. That's
absolutely.
Yeah. And this is rarely that I ask people to pitch their services, but could you just tell our viewers a little bit more about RapidAPI? I think a lot of people understand, it's a listing service to help discover APIs, but is there, can you directly integrate with APIs through the marketplace? Are you offering that sort of functionality?
Yeah, so basically it started about 3 years ago when our founder really found it very hard to find the APIs and start using them. So of course, there is programmable web, which had more of a directory, but you cannot consume the API. So that was the genesis of what RapidAPI is, which is why if you look at just the numbers, it's just amazing to see like almost 40% of the APIs that are there in programmable web on our marketplace, and over 500,000 developers across the globe. Only 40% in the US, the rest 60% across the globe. And so that's kind of the core offering to a developer. What we also have realized, the same challenge exists for large enterprises, as in the need to have an internal API hub within their company. We have Rakuten as a great example of one of our enterprise customers. And the idea is where they have literally 120 product and business teams across the globe. And we just provide an internal hub where all of the internal teams can actually see APIs that are published for internal consumption, along with a subset of third-party APIs their internal teams want to use. So that's kind of the other side of our offering, more targeting enterprises. And the idea is easy kind of discovery and consumption, which kind of really speaks to kind of the benefit of reuse of all the functionality that's been built, but also better kind of monitoring and understanding of internal and third-party API usage. So those are the two kind of broad offering that we have.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, the embeddable enterprise marketplace makes sense now. I just never even, thought of that for your business model, but that makes sense.
In fact, one of the interesting examples that I always love to share is from eBay days when we did an audit of kind of the number of checkout APIs that existed in the US. It was 5. So the point being, even for a progressive company like eBay, because there is no central kind of like repository or a place where people could find existing APIs, teams built stuff on their own. So there is a cost involved with that, time to market and having to maintain it and the technical debt. And so that's part of what we are trying to address for the large enterprises.
Excellent. All right, Kumar. Well, thank you for sharing. For time's sake, let's move on to Daniel.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity.
Of course.
Thank you for that. Let me share my screen and we should get going. I should not be as long. I definitely condensed mine down to get out of here at 1 o'clock. Bill, sorry about that.
We might go a little bit over. I think it's okay.
Sounds good.
So yeah, let's not put too much pressure.
All right, that sounds good. All right, can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, awesome. All right, so today we'll be talking a little bit about design-driven development and how the OpenAPI specification can really help out with some monetization efforts from a branding and standardization side to virtualization to just generally giving everyone a platform and a say in the development process of APIs. So just a real quick introduction, who Smartbear is, the company behind Swagger Hub, which is really kind of the poignant solution here, and Swagger tooling. But we're a Boston-based company. We have over 11 global offices. We focus mostly on developers, testing, and operations teams and giving them solutions to instill quality throughout the entire software delivery lifecycle. So think performance monitoring, functional test automation, code review, all the way down to test design and API design. We just purchased Zephyr and HitTest, two really neat test management tools. So again, just trying to expand that entire SDLC from a quality aspect. And today we'll be talking about APIs and their life cycle from a monetization standpoint. So like other pieces of software, we see APIs of having a very linear life cycle that has been prone to bottlenecks, just like any application. We have a planning design phase that often happens without the use of development or testers in there. Then there's this documentation phase that is unique to APIs and really the catalyst behind consumption and monetization. Unlike applications with interfaces, oftentimes that documentation is your breadwinner. That is where you're going to earn your money. So it's wildly important. And here, traditionally, it happens at that end stage. And then we're deploying and monitoring. But today, what we really want to talk about is how we can increase the ROI of your full production API by shortening everything here with design-driven development. So documentation and design happen at the same time with the Open API specification. So we'll go through a little bit of that. And then from there, we'll talk about mocking and actually virtualization and how that can help us develop and test not only internal APIs, but also external APIs much cheaper and much faster than, again, traditional methods. And then we're going to get to the deployment and monitoring stage just like we would normally. But again, we're doing 4 steps in only 2 steps and really drastically cutting down and increasing that feedback loop between all those involved, which was, I think, one of the really neat things about API monetization is that it was primarily fueled by a lot of developers and traditional kind of programming applications. And now it's moved towards people in the front face of the business. So product managers, data analysts actually coming up with ways to monetize these pieces of data that might already be hanging around organizations. So quickly, the advantages of the Open API specification and design-driven development. First is virtualization and consumption. One of the really cool things we'll talk about today with monetization is virtualizing that component and giving it 100% availability, even when we're not paying for it, even if our trial has run out, which went along great with Kumar's talk about how there's a lot of different payment models, and it really helps when we can virtualize and actually not cost ourselves money there. Secondly is exposing the right data and resources for both direct and indirect customers. So we'll talk about how it's not just that developer. It oftentimes comes from a really neat spot, a really neat ideation of where we can make money and monetize that data. And then lastly, which we'll actually explore probably the most here today, is driving governance and standardization for increasing brand equity and increasing that first kind of tangibility with the API itself as a consumer. So making sure that they feel comfortable using the API, they feel like it's standardized, and it reflects the brand that they want to do business with as part of their core application. So first off, your vertical can be another's horizontal. So in this case here, we never really know where that customer is going to come from. We never really know what our API is going to be consumed for. So we really have to kind of use standards, use the Open API specification to help us wrap that in and allow others to feel like they're a part of what we're doing by giving them solid documentation, by giving them solid standards that they can go forward on. We don't really want to build our service around schemas and modules that we can kind of store in maybe a Git repository and reuse. While you'll see that we actually have that as a core capability, and it is great. Standards are really that first wall, that first layer of defense against a sprawling API. Having easy to understand standards for the entire team, both internal and external, can really help with our consumption. And then the API value chain here is made up of that organization's platform, which we talked about, and different consumers. So either that direct API consumer that's building off of that particular response and data, or an indirect API consumer that might be using you on a third-party level, chained together. And then finally, partners, people that are actively building off your application and trying to build an ecosystem around you. All of these are huge time savers using the Open API spec. And just a really cool example that we see when talking to customers, we had an insurance company that was coming together, and they had this piece of data that they just had in a database, just tracking along of actually noise pollution driven by cars and neighborhoods. So by using some analytics, they were able to come up with kind of a score. And again, they used it in their insurance model when they could. Some states allowed them to, but generally they had this huge database in this data warehouse that wasn't getting monetized. And what they had is they actually had someone working on the data team come up with a way to monetize it, and that is to sell it to real estate companies as a measure of neighborhood friendliness. So now many of the new like Zillow type companies, Redfin, actually have these neighborhood ratings, and that is built off a third API coming from, again, an insurance company and a product manager, a data manager that had no development experience, but was able to connect the dots between this data that they had and actually an end consumer that might find that data valuable. And with the open API specification, start to mock that out and get that out the door pretty quickly. Another really cool thing I think is virtualization here is free ungated access to premium APIs using the OAS. There's a ton of mocking tools out there. At Smartbear, we have one called Service V Pro. Swagger Hub also has some pretty light mocking capabilities. But to Kumar's point, that 3 cents per call, that's really expensive for a lot of developers, a lot of small startups, even on the enterprise level, to just start messing around with internally and coming up with ideas. But by virtualizing it, we actually cut down the cost. So we have the entire database, we have all the responses, we know how that API acts, and we can manipulate behavior, responses, data without actually paying for it. So we can build our own application, we can build a larger service ecosystem using virtualized assets, and then as soon as we're ready to go to production, to start having paying customers, we can turn on the actual premium services and then have an income flow. So we solve our cash flow problem where we have money coming in the door on both sides, and we're able to pay our bills. So this is a huge cut down of actual costs during the development phase as we try to monetize against some of these more expensive premium APIs. Google they have a freemium tier, is not bad, but a lot of more high-tech, think like security APIs, they're just not going to have a totally free tier. So this is a way to kind of get around that and still keep everyone happy. We'll have a nice development and tested platform, and we can drive more numbers for that primary ecosystem. And then with the OAS and standards, this is what we're going to kind of devolve on here, is making it a good experience, right? This is your brand. You don't have a nice UI. You don't have slick graphics that you can go kind of show that message that you care about the consumer, you care about the user. For APIs, it's really all about the documentation, and it's really all about the standard and design behind that API that really shows off to the development community that you care about this. This is something that you're not taking lightly, that is just thrown together by whoever was free that day on the development team, but is actually something that was thought through from top down within the organization. So just a standardization process, a real life example of something that we actually went through a couple of years ago in a failed version 3 redesign of an API. These are some of the standards we had for our new API. We wanted it to be snake case, obviously RESTful. We didn't want gRPC. We really wanted that to be a RESTful API. HTTPS, so secure. Our descriptions wanted to have clarifying languages and reuse objects. That was one of the things, actually reasons why we upgraded. We just had a lot of spaghetti code out there that was running all over itself, and we really wanted to condense that down and build some modular pieces to our API. And then filter internal fields only. We didn't want to have customer-facing components actually leak out into our documentation. So these are some of the standards that we had when coming up with our V through V2 redesign. And like a lot of companies, I think this was our standard governance process. This is kind of a traditional look at it, but we have our ideation, and then we have our agreement on what those standards are going to be. We have an education section, which quite honestly, usually traditionally has fallen on like the wiki, or maybe a WordPress documentation site, but we didn't have the nice, pretty documentation we have now, thanks to Swagger tooling and the Open API specification. But that was our education, running through weekly stand-ups and Scrum meetings, actually talking about those standards. And then once we had the API creation, developers had to actually go in and work, right? And they're not really, well, they're not the next step, enforced. There's no actual enforcement on any of these standards. So while we had a great list, over time, as we had new developers join, we had old developers, and particularly, we had one old evangelist leave, which really hurt our entire momentum. And that's because we were relying on having our API in our wiki. We had our one evangelist who knew everything about it. He was educating the team on standards, and we didn't actually have that single source of truth that now tools like Swagger Hub are filling that gap. And that's my next point, is there is a better way to standardize and come with a strong brand, a strong UX to your end consumer and delight them on the first time. Our high-level goals here are obviously branding with a common voice and brand credibility. We don't want mistakes in our writing. We don't want typos, obviously. We want our documentation to all look consistent with not only the product, but maybe our other APIs. There's common standards across maybe functionality in the UI. Maybe we have different products that all might function differently on the UI, but that's our chance to really come together on the back end and create common standards across organizations and give the marketplace one consistent look at your application's design, your API design, and also easier onboarding. When we're consistent with what we do, onboarding is much simpler. And that also means that we're consistent with some larger practices. So you can go through and look at some popular APIs like Twilio, Stripe, companies that are doing things the API first way, and kind of not creating anti-patterns when we go with the onboarding process. And then lastly, reuse. When we come with standards and we actually want to design first, we're going to be able to reuse a lot more of objects. We're going to be able to reuse error codes, success codes. We won't have to rewrite all these things out when we actually focus on the design first. And our desired outcomes out of all this are, one, minimize the time it takes to enforce guidelines. We have tons of customers that have come to us that manually review all these guidelines. They first have a technical team make sure that their definition is ready to go and up to par with what the architect may want. And then secondly, because again, there is no UI to this, there is a brand element. So maybe the API branding team also gets a hold manually and start to pick their way through it. Having this automated stylization through the Open API specification is huge there, and especially with Swagger Hub helping you out. And then minimizing the number of APIs not complying with style guidelines, improving visibility of the state of APIs, so actually having a place where you can centrally talk and work over them and talk about, comment through standards, and not just have maybe a YAML file or an XML file or even a Git repository at best case, getting Slacked or emailed back and forth between teams trying to worry about their standards. And then lastly is improve that process of feedback. I think that's, at the end of the day, that's really what we're trying to improve here through the Open API specification, is driving feedback between the product manager, that information architecture, data person, all the way at the business level, through with the development and architectural teams to operations and testers. So really trying to get everybody on one page and not slow down development time, not slow down testing time, and get that API out to market as quickly as possible. And then actually, this is really lastly, just some quick actual rules in the brand standardization that put pen to paper here. Things like API info, title, description, contact. These are all things at the enterprise level need to be worked on by a brand team. These are things that people have standards about this. They care what words we use in descriptions. And APIs are becoming such a focal point of that company's interaction with the market. Like in the last presentation, Salesforce, 50% of revenue interacting through APIs. That's a lot of developers who have not the impression of the sales and marketing team that might work in Salesforce.com or work in the Marketing Cloud, but a whole bunch of developers that only know Salesforce through their documentation, through their work with the API. So that's why these things like these rules are huge. Operations and models and paths, these are all great for not only, again, brand and things like that, but also testing, being consistent with things that are actually going in the code. So you're having the ability to use regex rules to get through and create tests. That's huge, and that you're only going to get through that by actually coming with a design-first approach. So that's all I have for the talk today. It really, again, from Kumar's talk, I really wanted to talk about branding and the time we take behind actually coming up with this API that then gets to the Rapid API marketplace and is used.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks so much, Daniel. A lot of great input on the importance of reuse, consistency, standards, and just generally the importance of design-driven development. Because I'm guessing like this sort of standardization directly equates to improving the service to the point where you can actually increase how much you charge per call, increase the monetization potential. Do you see that like direct correlation there?
Absolutely. There are things that if we talk about like a SaaS application where companies spend millions of dollars on design teams, on UX, on brand standards, and APIs are becoming such a big part of businesses, yet they might not have those same kind of constraints on their API. They're not thinking about the brand. They're not thinking about reusing and all the little things that normally go into a business. And when you look at a SaaS company, you would definitely have those things installed on front facing. But the back end and that API, as fast as it's growing, it is definitely often left off that map there.
Gotcha. Yeah, like you said, it's important how words are used in describing APIs now, coming down to the operation name, the title name, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get calls is through the developer portals and documentation. So it's the most important place to improve. I had one thing I was curious about.
Yep.
If you look at the OAS schema, you see objects for things like title, description, terms of service, versioning, what license we're using. Do you ever foresee OAS offering some sort of object that does describe the monetization method, like the model in place? Or do you think that sort of business metadata just doesn't really have a place in the description specification?
I definitely think the metadata will definitely expand to that part. I think it's something that as we see 3.0 kind of mature, we still, quite honestly, have a little bit of a bifurcated market with 2.0 and 3.0. And 3.0, as hopefully the continuing development teams move towards, will hopefully open up versioning that has things for like monetization aspects, for things, like business models that would be really cool to have in there and become a part of the documentation, tying together that spec, the documentation, and ultimately the payment gateway is definitely advantageous to the developer and the consumer. So I can see that for sure.
Yeah, and for other parties like RapidAPI, I mean, having some more machine readable data about the operational aspects of the service could help, unite things, act for good comparison marketplaces.
Absolutely.
Yep.
All right, guys, we've gone a little bit over here, so I think I'm going to call it here. I just have some outro slides real quick. I really appreciate you taking the time to share with our community. These sort of events make it great just to connect outside of our larger conferences.
Yeah.
So it's great to have this. I just want to say thank you to Curity. They sponsor Nordic APIs and make a lot of this possible. So thank you so much. for our viewers, you can follow Nordic APIs on Twitter right there. And we also do have a Slack channel just for some more in-depth discussion with our community members. And we have a join link, I think, on our Twitter posted still. If not, message us and we'll add you. Our next event is in Austin, like I said. Call for speakers is open, so put in your submission if you'd like to be a part of that. And if you'd like to be a part of this sort of online webinar series, that's great as well. Contact us at info@nordicapis.com and we can set that up. I'm really interested in exploring what other niche topics we can come together on and help accelerate the space. So that's all for monetizing APIs. Thanks again, Kumar and Daniel, for sharing with us and everyone for tuning in. It should be live on YouTube now, so you guys can go watch yourselves. All right. Thanks so much.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye.